Imagine you are a German anti-tank gunner in June 1941. You've just crossed the border, feeling invincible after crushing Europe. Suddenly, a massive, blocky titan emerges from the forest. You fire your 37mm gun, direct hit, but the shell simply bounces off like a pebble. You fire again, and again, but the monster keeps coming, crushing your gun under its massive tracks. This was the KV-1. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, it was the most heavily armored tank in the world, a steel ghost that forced the Wehrmacht to realize that the war in the East would be a descent into mechanical hell. Today, we're looking at the Soviet giant that redefined the meaning of heavy armor. The origin of the KV-1 was born from the harsh lessons of the Winter War against Finland. The Soviet High Command realized that their light tanks, like the T-26 and BT-7, were far too vulnerable to anti-tank fire and fortifications. They needed a breakthrough tank, a machine that could lead an assault against heavily defended lines without fear of being destroyed. While other designers were still experimenting with multi-turreted monsters like the T-35, a young team of engineers at the Kirov plant in Leningrad, led by Joseph Kotin, proposed a radical alternative, a single-turreted tank with unprecedented armor thickness. This was the birth of the KV series, named after the Soviet defense minister, Kliment Voroshilov. When the first KV-1 prototypes arrived on the Finnish front in 1939, they were a revelation. In their very first engagement, a single KV-1 was hit over 40 times by Finnish anti-tank guns, yet it remained fully operational, its thick steel skin protecting the crew from every impact. This performance effectively ended the debate over multi-turreted tanks. The Soviet leadership saw the KV-1 as the future of heavy warfare, a 45-ton fortress that prioritized protection above all else. It was a massive, industrial-looking machine, built with thick, rolled steel plates that were welded together in a way that emphasized brute strength over elegance or speed. The heart of the KV-1's protection was its 75mm armor, which was unheard of for a medium to heavy tank in 1940. At a time when most German tanks carried only 30mm of protection, the KV-1 was practically a moving bunker. Even the most powerful German guns of the early war period had to be at point-blank range to have any hope of a penetration. This thick skin gave the Soviet crews a sense of absolute security, allowing them to lead attacks with a level of aggression that shocked the invading German forces. It was the unbreakable shield of the Red Army, designed to soak up damage while its own guns cleared the way for the infantry. To arm this titan, the Soviets chose the 76mm F-32, and later the Zis-5, cannon. While this was a powerful gun for 1941, capable of destroying any German tank at long distances, it was arguably undergunned for a chassis of its size. The KV-1 was designed to be a breakthrough vehicle, and while the 76mm was effective, many commanders felt it lacked the massive high-explosive punch needed for destroying heavy bunkers. However, in the early tank-on-tank duels of Barbarossa, the gun was more than enough to turn Panzer IIIs and IVs into smoking ruins before they could even get within their own effective firing range. Powering a 45-ton monster was no easy feat, and the KV-1 was fitted with the legendary V2 diesel engine. This 12-cylinder masterpiece provided 600 horsepower, giving the tank a surprisingly decent top speed of nearly 35 km per hour on roads. However, the transmission was the KV-1's Achilles heel. It was a primitive, heavy-duty gearbox that required immense physical strength to operate. Drivers often had to use a literal sledgehammer to force the gears into place, and the mechanical stress of moving such a heavy mass often led to catastrophic failures long before the tank ever reached the battlefield. The manufacturing of the KV-1 was a massive industrial undertaking centered in Leningrad and later Tankograd in the Ural Mountains. Because of its thick armor and complex suspension, it was far more expensive and time-consuming to build than the legendary T-34. Yet, in the desperate months of 1941, the Soviets prioritized KV-1 production above almost everything else. It was a tank built for a war of survival, a machine that sacrificed crew comfort, visibility, and mechanical refinement for the one thing that mattered most in the face of the Blitzkrieg, the ability to stand its ground and refuse to die. The combat record of the KV-1 in the summer of 1941 is the stuff of military legends. The most famous encounter occurred near the town of Raseiniai in Lithuania, where a single KV-1 managed to stop an entire German armored division for 48 hours. This lone tank sat on a vital road, blocking a supply column and shrugging off dozens of direct hits from German anti-tank guns. Even a battery of 88mm anti-aircraft guns struggled to knock it out. This engagement sent shockwaves through the Wehrmacht command. They realized they were facing a steel ghost that their standard tactics couldn't handle, a machine that could single-handedly halt a blitzkrieg offensive. The psychological impact of the KV-1 on German soldiers was devastating. Throughout 1941, German reports were filled with frantic descriptions of invincible Russian monsters that simply ignored machine gun and anti-tank fire. The Germans found themselves in a position where they had to use desperate measures to stop the KVs, including attacking them with satchel charges, dragging heavy field artillery to the front lines, or calling in Stuka dive bombers for precision strikes. The KV-1 destroyed the myth of German armored superiority, proving that Soviet engineering could produce a machine that was tactically superior to anything the Third Reich possessed at the time. However, the KV-1's greatest enemy was not German shells, but its own mechanical unreliability. In the chaotic retreats of 1941, more KV-1s were lost to breakdowns than to enemy action. The heavy transmission and final drives were constantly failing under the strain of the Russian mud and the long marches. Soviet crews, often poorly trained and lacking spare parts, were forced to abandon their multi-million ruble machines on the side of the road. A tank that could survive 100 hits was useless if it couldn't move 50 kilometers without its gearbox shattering into pieces. This mechanical frailty meant that the KV-1 was often a one-battle tank, lethal in its first engagement but unlikely to survive the march to the next. Visibility inside the KV-1 was another critical flaw that hampered its combat effectiveness. The commander had very few periscopes, and the vision slits were narrow and easily blinded by mud or dust. In the heat of battle, a KV-1 crew was often practically blind to their surroundings, allowing nimble German anti-tank teams to sneak up on the sides or rear of the tank. The KV-1 was a brawler that could take a punch, but it struggled to see where the punches were coming from. This led to many KVs being blinded and then destroyed by German infantry, despite their near-invincible armor. As the war progressed into 1942, the KV-1 began to lose its tactical advantage. The Germans began to deploy the long-barreled 75mm guns on the Panzer IV and the Stu G3, which could finally penetrate the KV's armor at reasonable ranges. To counter this, the Soviets developed the KV-1S, a lightened version with thinner armor to improve speed and reliability. But this move was controversial, as it effectively turned the KV into a more expensive and less efficient version of the T-34. The heavy tank was losing its identity, struggling to balance the need for protection with the reality that a tank must be able to move to win. By the Battle of Stalingrad, the KV-1 was the iron spine of the Soviet defensive lines. In the brutal urban fighting, the KV's thick armor allowed it to act as a mobile fortress, absorbing German fire while Soviet infantry cleared the buildings. It was here, in the rubble and the cold, that the KV-1 proved its worth as a weapon of attrition. It didn't need to be fast or elegant, it just needed to be there, a 45-ton wall of steel that refused to move. It was the unyielding guard of the Volga, a machine that bought the Red Army the time it needed to prepare the massive counter-offensives that would eventually turn the tide of the war. By late 1942 and early 1943, the appearance of the German Tiger tank made the KV-1 officially obsolete. The Tiger could destroy a KV-1 from over 1,500 meters, while the KV's 76mm gun couldn't even scratch the Tiger's front armor. The Red Army was faced with a crisis. Their heavy tank was no longer the king of the battlefield. This led to a desperate period of evolutionary panic at Tankograd. The engineers knew they couldn't just add more armor, the chassis was already at its breaking point. They needed a bigger gun. This led to the development of the KV-85, a hybrid that mounted a powerful 85mm gun in a new, larger turret. The KV-85 was a stopgap measure, but it was a lethal one. For the first time, a Soviet heavy tank had the firepower to actually threaten the Tiger and Panther at distance. However, only 148 of these tanks were built. The KV-85 was the final evolution of the original Kliment Voroshilov chassis, a machine that was being pushed far beyond its original design limits. It was a bridge between two eras, the era of the primitive, heavy KV-1 and the future era of the legendary IS-2. The KV-85 proved that the Soviet heavy tank philosophy was still alive, but it needed a complete redesign to survive the new tiger-filled reality of the Eastern Front. The mechanical lessons learned from the KV-1's failures were integrated into the next generation of Soviet armor. Engineers finally realized that a heavy tank must have a transmission that can handle its weight. The Tankograd designers worked tirelessly to refine the V2 engine and the gearbox, moving away from the sledgehammer shifting of the 1941 models. The KV-1 had been an expensive and painful teacher, but its failures laid the groundwork for the most successful heavy tank series of the war. Without the trials and tribulations of the KV-1, the Soviet Union would never have developed the machines that eventually crushed the Third Reich. Interestingly, the KV-1 also saw service on the other side. German forces captured several dozen KV-1s during the early months of the war and were so impressed by the armor that they put them back into service as the Panzerkampfwagen 753R. The Germans even went as far as to install their own commanders' cupolas and 75mm guns on some captured KVs to improve their visibility and lethality. To see a Soviet giant with German crosses painted on its side was a surreal testament to the respect the Wehrmacht had for the KV-1's protection. Even the enemy acknowledged that, despite its flaws, the KV-1 was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Life for the crews of the KV-1 was a cycle of extreme pride and extreme frustration. They knew they were in the safest tank in the world, but they also knew they might be abandoned in the middle of a retreat because of a broken bolt in the transmission. The five-man crew was cramped into a space filled with the smell of diesel and hot metal, working together to keep their iron Kliment alive. The driver was the most important member of the team, often possessing arms like a weightlifter from fighting the gears all day. They weren't just soldiers, they were part-time mechanics and full-time survivors, tethered to a machine that was both their best friend and their worst enemy. By 1944, the original KV-1 had almost entirely disappeared from the front lines, replaced by the much more powerful IS-2. The surviving KVs were relegated to secondary fronts or converted into specialized vehicles like heavy tractors and recovery tanks. Their role as the breakthrough spearhead was over, but their impact on the war was undeniable. They had been the iron shield that broke the momentum of the Blitzkrieg in 1941, buying the Soviet Union the precious months it needed to evacuate its industry and rebuild its army. The KV-1 was the first Soviet supertank, a machine that taught the world that the Red Army would not go quietly into the night. The final analysis of the KV-1 is one of a brilliant but flawed pioneer. It was a tank that was ahead of its time in terms of armor, but lagging behind in terms of mechanical maturity. It proved that a single-turreted heavy tank was the future of armored warfare, ending the era of the land battleship once and for all. While the T-34 is often called the tank that won the war, the KV-1 was the tank that saved the Soviet Union in its darkest hour. It was the only machine capable of standing up to the panzers in 1941, and its presence alone forced the Germans to abandon their plans for a quick and easy victory in the East. The legacy of the KV-1 is seen in every heavy tank that followed, from the Tiger to the M1 Abrams. It established the concept that a heavy tank must be an assault weapon, capable of leading from the front and absorbing massive amounts of fire. The Soviet Tankograd philosophy, which was born with the KV-1, prioritized mass producibility and raw power over over-engineered perfection. This approach eventually allowed the Soviets to overwhelm the Germans with a tidal wave of steel. The KV-1 was the first brick in that wall of iron, a machine that proved that in total war, durability and protection are the ultimate strategic assets. Today, only a few KV-1 tanks survive in museums, with the most famous examples at the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow and the Bovington Tank Museum. Standing next to one of these surviving giants, you are struck by the crude, brutal nature of its construction. You can see the rough weld lines and the massive, heavy plates that once defied the entire Wehrmacht. It doesn't look like a high-tech weapon, it looks like a piece of industrial machinery designed to crush anything in its path. It is a haunting artifact of a time when the world was on fire and the fate of nations rested on the thickness of a steel plate. In popular culture, the KV-1 remains a fan favorite for its unstoppable reputation in the early war years. It appears in countless documentaries, books, and video games as the ultimate boss of 1941. This cultural memory has kept the legend of the KV-1 alive, reminding new generations of the time when a single Soviet tank could hold off an entire German division. While it was eventually eclipsed by the Tiger and the IS-2, the KV-1 remains the definitive symbol of Soviet resistance, a rugged, unrefined, and immensely powerful machine that represented the sheer will of a nation to survive at any cost. The story of the KV-1 is also a story of the men who designed it under the threat of Stalin's purges and worked in freezing factories to build it. It is a story of the crews who took a mechanically temperamental machine into the most violent battles in human history. The KV-1 was a reflection of the Soviet Union itself, raw, powerful, prone to internal failure, but ultimately unbreakable. It was a machine built for a war of attrition, where the only thing that mattered was being the last one standing on the battlefield. The KV-1 wasn't just a tank, it was a 45-ton declaration of war that the Germans were never truly prepared to answer. In the final analysis, the KV-1 was the mother of heavy tanks. It was a flawed masterpiece that paved the way for the titans of the Cold War. It taught the world that armor thickness has a quality all its own, and that a tank's best feature is its ability to stay in the fight. The steel ghost of Raseiniai has long been silent, but its influence is felt every time a modern heavy tank rolls onto the field. The KV-1 remains a monument to a time when industrial might and human courage combined to create an iron giant that changed the course of history, a machine that stood its ground when everything else was falling apart.